My uncle broke into my dead grandmother's house on the day of her funeral, changed every lock behind my back, and then sobbed on my doorstep, begging me to save him from what I built. I still had dirt from the graveside service on the hem of my dress when I pulled into the driveway on Larkspur Lane. It was almost 9 at night. I just wanted to water Grandma's ferns like I did every week, the way I'd done since I was 8 years old. My key slid into the lock and stopped. It wouldn't turn. I tried it 3 times. Same result. I knocked, more out of confusion than anything, and the porch light flicked on above me. The door opened on the chain first, then all the way. My Uncle Gerald stood there in Grandma's bathrobe, the pale blue one with the frayed cuffs that still hung on the hook in her bathroom that morning. "Marin," he said, like I was the one who didn't belong. "Why won't my key work?" "Because I changed the locks." He said it flatly, like he was telling me the mail had come. I stood on the porch my grandmother had swept every Sunday for 40 years and felt my whole chest go cold. "This is my house, Gerald. You know that. The will says—" "I'm the oldest," he said, cutting me off. "I'm her son. This house is mine now and you're going to have to accept that." I told him I'd already spoken to the estate lawyer that week, that the deed had been transferred to me 2 years before Grandma died, that this wasn't a matter of opinion. He just smiled, the same smile he used to wear right before asking her for money. "Take me to court then," he said. "You know how long that takes? 18 months, maybe 2 years. I'll be sleeping in her bed the whole time." He started to close the door, then paused, like he wanted to make sure I heard the last part. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, sweetheart. Look it up." The door shut. I heard the deadbolt turn, the same sound I used to hear from inside that house as a kid. Right before Grandma called out, "Locked up tight, Marin Bear, you're safe." I stood on the porch a long time, long enough for the motion light to click off and leave me in the dark. I wasn't thinking about the will anymore, or the lawyer, or even the fact that my grandmother had been in the ground for 6 hours. I was thinking about the one thing Gerald didn't know I still had, something Grandma had given me 2 years earlier, back when her hands first started shaking too badly to sign her own checks. Power of attorney, full authority over every account she had. She never revoked it. Not once. Gerald thought he'd taken the house. He had no idea what he'd actually walked into. My name is Marin Voss. I'm 27 years old, and for a long time I believed family was the one thing you didn't have to fight for. My grandmother taught me otherwise. In the end, though not in the way either of us expected, I was 8 when my parents died. A logging truck lost its brakes on Route 9 outside Belhaven, Ohio, on a Tuesday in October, and by Wednesday, I was living in my grandmother's house on Larkspur Lane with a suitcase that still smelled like my mother's laundry detergent. Eleanor Voss was 61 years old. She had already raised 2 sons of her own, my father, David, and his older brother, Gerald, and she was not, by any reasonable measure, supposed to start over with a 3rd child. She did it anyway. She never once made me feel like an inconvenience. I lived in that house for 10 years, in the small bedroom at the top of the stairs with the slanted ceiling, the one that used to be my father's. Grandma kept his old baseball trophies on the shelf the whole time I was growing up, right next to my school photos, like the 2 of us belonged in the same row. She never missed a single school event, not one, even the ones that should have belonged to younger parents. She sat in the 3rd row at every spring concert in a folding chair she brought herself because the gym chairs hurt her back. She drove me to swim practice at 5:30 in the morning for 3 winters straight, sipping gas station coffee in the parking lot until practice let out, reading paperback mysteries under the dome light so I'd never once have to wait for a ride. When I turned 16 and got my license, she handed me the keys to her old Buick with a laminated index card of emergency numbers taped to the visor, my own handwriting on half of them because she'd made me write it myself. Said a person needed to know the numbers by heart, not just have them written down somewhere. When I turned 18 and moved into a studio apartment across town for community college, I didn't really leave. I came back every single Sunday for the next 9 years. Pot roast in the winter, tomato sandwiches in the summer, and always, the same walk through her garden before dinner, where she'd point out which hostas needed dividing and which roses she was losing to the aphids. She kept a running list on the refrigerator of things she wanted me to learn before she was gone, though neither of us said that part out loud. How to blind bake a pie crust, how to bleed a radiator, how to talk a mechanic out of overcharging you. Small, deliberate pieces of a life she was quietly handing down, one Sunday at a time, long before either of us knew how little time we actually had left. Gerald was a different story. He was 54 the year Grandma died, 20 years older than me, and I can count on one hand the number of times he showed up at that house without needing something. Christmas sometimes. Easter, if it fell on a good year. Mother's Day only when his checking account required it. He'd sit at her table, eat her food, tell her how much he loved her, and by dessert he'd have worked the conversation around to whatever crisis had brought him there. A car repair, a medical bill, a business that was, according to him, one small loan away from turning everything around. I have an early memory of the pattern from when I was maybe 11. Gerald showed up on a Sunday with a brochure for a used pontoon boat he wanted to buy for a lake rental business, some scheme involving a marina 2 counties over. He didn't ask Grandma for cash that time. He asked her to co-sign a loan, $17,000, promising he'd make every payment himself. Grandma, who wanted so badly to believe her son could build something that lasted, signed it. He made 4 payments. Then the lake business folded, the marina owner sued him for breach of contract, and the loan defaulted straight onto Grandma's credit. A woman who had never missed a bill in her life suddenly fielding collection calls at 73. It took her 2 years to repair the damage. Gerald apologized exactly once, in a card, and never mentioned it again. I remember finding that card years later in a kitchen drawer, the ink faded, and asking Grandma about it. She just sighed and said, "Your uncle has never once understood that other people's names aren't free to use." I didn't understand yet how literally that sentence would end up applying to me. The clearest memory I have of that pattern is Thanksgiving of 2022. I was 23. Gerald showed up an hour late, smelling like cigarettes, with a laminated 1-page business plan for something he called Voss Auto Deals, a used car lot he wanted to open on the old gas station lot off Route 40. He needed $40,000. He wanted Grandma to take out a home equity loan against the Larkspur Lane house to fund it, and he brought paperwork from a loan officer he already knew, like he'd expected her to say yes before she'd even heard the pitch. She said no. Gently at first, the way she said no to everything, with an explanation about her fixed income and her age, and the fact that the house was the only real asset she had left. Gerald's face changed when she said it a second time. He stood up from the table so fast his chair scraped the hardwood floor Grandma had refinished herself 2 summers before. "You'll give this house to her," he said, and he pointed at me. "But you won't help your own son build something real." "Gerald, she's not even yours," he said. 23 years old, sitting at that table with a plate of stuffing going cold in front of me, and my uncle looked me dead in the eye and told my grandmother I wasn't really family. "She's David's kid. I'm your son. I've been your son for 51 years. Grandma didn't raise her voice. She never did with him. She just said, very quietly, that the house would go to Marin when she passed, that she'd already decided, and that Gerald was welcome at her table as long as he could be civil about it. He left without his coat. It was 31 degrees outside that night. He sat in his car in her driveway for 20 minutes with the engine running before he finally drove off, and Grandma watched him go from the front window with an expression I didn't understand yet. I understand it now. It was grief for a son who kept showing her exactly who he was over and over, and her refusing to stop hoping he'd change. She said it to me plainly, more than once, always at the holiday table where Gerald could hear it. "This house is Marin's. When I'm gone, it's hers. I've told the lawyer. I've told the bank. There's no version of this where it goes any other way." She said it like a woman closing a door she'd already checked twice. 2 years before she died, Grandma had a small stroke. Minor, the doctor said, but it left her right hand trembling too badly to sign her name reliably, and it scared both of us enough that she asked me to go with her to see her attorney, a careful, silver-haired man named Elliot Marsh, who'd handled her affairs since before I was born. That was the day she gave me power of attorney. Full authority over her finances, her accounts, her utilities, everything. She told Elliot, in front of me, that Gerald was not to be given any authority over anything, ever, under any circumstances. Elliot wrote it into his file. I still remember the way Grandma signed her name that day. Shaky, but legible. Determined not to let her failing hand be the reason her wishes didn't hold. She never revoked that authority. Not in the 2 years that followed. Not during her decline. Not during the final 6 weeks in hospice care at Bellhaven Memorial, when the cancer that had been quietly growing in her pancreas since the spring finally caught up to everything else. I was there almost every day of those 6 weeks. Gerald came 4 times. Twice to sit at her bedside for less than 20 minutes. Once to ask me, in the hallway outside her room, whether I knew yet what she was leaving him. And once, 11 days before she died, with a folder of papers he said were hospice consent forms, and a notary he'd brought with him, a heavy-set man named Walt Higgins, who I recognized vaguely from Gerald's old bowling league. I remember being grateful, honestly, that Gerald was handling paperwork for once instead of asking for money. Grandma was heavily medicated that week, drifting in and out, and I stepped out to get coffee while Walt got his stamp and his signature pad ready. I didn't think about it again. I had a dying grandmother and a full-time job and a stack of hospice bills of my own to manage. I didn't have room in my head to wonder what an uncle who hadn't lifted a finger in 30 years was suddenly so eager to notarize. She died on June 2nd, a Tuesday, the same day of the week my parents had died 19 years earlier, which felt like either a cruelty or a mercy. I still haven't decided which. The funeral was 4 days later on a Saturday at Whitcomb Funeral Home on Corbin Avenue. Gerald cried through the entire service. Loud, gasping, theatrical crying, the kind that made the funeral director keep glancing over with a box of tissues like he wasn't sure whether to intervene. I sat 2 rows back and watched my uncle perform grief for a woman he'd spent 30 years disappointing, and I didn't feel a single flicker of doubt about what the will said. I'd seen the paperwork myself. Elliot Marsh had confirmed it twice. The house on Larkspur Lane, the one Gerald was crying so hard about losing, had been legally mine since the day Grandma signed her name in his office 2 years before. I had no idea, standing at that graveside with a fistful of dirt in my hand, that Gerald had already tried once to take it from me. I had no idea that Walt Higgins's notary stamp had gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. All I knew that night, standing on my grandmother's porch with a key that no longer worked, was that my uncle had broken into a dead woman's house on the day of her funeral, and told me to my face that possession was 9/10 of the law. He was about to learn what I was made of. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and every account Grandma had ever given me access to lined up in front of me, and I started making a list. Gerald thought he'd won because he had a set of new keys and a bathrobe that wasn't his. He hadn't thought about the electric bill. He hadn't thought about the insurance. He definitely hadn't thought about the fact that I'd spent every Sunday of my adult life in that house, which meant I knew things about it that he'd never bothered to learn in 56 years of showing up only when he needed something. I knew the electrical panel in the basement was original to 1962, a Federal Pacific panel that Grandma's own electrician had warned her about twice, and that she'd been putting off replacing because of the cost. I knew the foundation on the north side had a crack that had been slowly widening since the flood of 2019, the kind of crack that starts as a cosmetic problem and ends as a structural one. I knew the pipes in the crawl space were original copper, poorly insulated, and that Grandma kept the heat at 68 degrees all winter specifically, because a plumber had told her that anything colder risked a freeze. Gerald had eaten dinner in that house maybe a dozen times in the last decade. He didn't know any of it. He'd never asked. The first thing I did was call the utility company. Every account on Larkspur Lane, power, water, gas, was still in Grandma's name, which meant that as her power of attorney and now the legal owner of the property, I had every right to close them out. I did it Monday morning, calmly, on the phone with a representative named Denise, who processed the request without asking a single question. By Monday afternoon, the house Gerald had broken into 4 days earlier had no electricity. He called me that night, furious. furious. You cut my power? It was never your power to have, I said. The account was in Grandma's name. I closed it. If you want electricity in a house you don't legally own, you'll need to open a new account under your own name. He tried. I found out later, through Denise, who I'd stayed friendly with on the phone, that Gerald's credit was bad enough that the utility company required an $800 deposit before they'd turn the power back on. He didn't have $800. He told Grandma at Thanksgiving 2022 that he needed $40,000 for a car lot he never opened, and 3.5 years later he still couldn't scrape together enough for a light bulb. The insurance came next. Grandma's homeowner's policy, the one that had protected that house for 31 years, was in her name and mine, added 2 years earlier when I got power of attorney. I called the agent, a soft-spoken man named Harold Pruitt who'd handled Grandma's policy since before I was born, and explained that the property owner listed on the deed was requesting the policy be updated to reflect current ownership. Harold pulled the deed himself. My name, not Gerald's. He told me, apologetically, that continuing coverage for an occupant with no legal claim to the property would violate the terms of the policy entirely, and that he had no choice but to cancel it. Gerald tried to get new coverage under his own name the following week. No insurer in the county would write a policy on a house he couldn't prove he owned. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The reverse mortgage was the part I hadn't even planned. Grandma had taken one out 4 years earlier, before I had power of attorney, back when the roof needed replacing and her retirement savings weren't stretching the way she'd hoped. I'd known about it in the abstract, the way you know about a distant relative's illness, but I hadn't thought through what it meant until Elliot Marsh called me 8 days after the funeral. There's a balance due, he said. $300,000. Reverse mortgages come due in full the moment the borrower passes. The lender, Meridian Trust, has already sent notice. I asked him what happened if it wasn't paid. He explained in his careful lawyer's voice that the lender would move to foreclose, and that whoever was occupying the property at the time would be evicted regardless of any other claim they believed they had. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat with that information for exactly 1 day before I decided not to tell Gerald myself. I let Meridian Trust do it. The notice arrived at the Larkspur Lane address 9 days after the funeral, addressed to the estate of Eleanor Voss, and Gerald, who was checking the mail because he believed himself the man of the house now, opened it. He called me screaming, $300,000? Are you insane? You did this. I didn't take out a reverse mortgage, Gerald. Grandma did 4 years ago for a new roof. If you want the house so badly, you should probably figure out how you're going to pay it off. You've got 30 days. You're supposed to be handling the estate, not sabotaging it. I am handling the estate, I said. You're the one squatting in a house that isn't yours. He hung up on me that time. I remember sitting at my kitchen table afterward and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was calm. Not triumph, not yet. Just a kind of clarity. The sense of watching a structure I hadn't built collapse under its own weight, one piece at a time, exactly the way I'd known it would if I simply stopped propping it up. I called 4 contractors that week, all of them people Grandma had used over the years, and told them the truth, more or less, that the estate needed accurate estimates for repairs before any sale or transfer could move forward. Every one of them had worked in that house before. Every one of them knew exactly what they'd find. The foundation guy, a heavyset contractor named Ronnie Petrakis, who'd poured a new stretch of sidewalk for Grandma back in 2018, walked the crawl space with a flashlight and came back up shaking his head. $60,000, he said. Maybe more once he got in there properly, because that crack on the north side had grown another 2 inches since he'd last seen it. The electrician, a younger man named Felix, who'd apprenticed under the guy who originally warned Grandma about the panel, took one look at the Federal Pacific box in the basement and told me it needed to come out entirely. $30,000 minimum, and he wouldn't sign off on it being safe to leave live in the meantime. I didn't need the repairs done. I needed the numbers on paper, in writing, dated, so that whoever ended up owning that house understood exactly what they were inheriting along with it. I made sure Gerald got copies. I told myself it was only fair. He deserved to know what he was fighting so hard to keep. The city was the piece I hadn't engineered at all, and it turned out to be the sharpest blade in the whole thing. Larkspur Lane sat inside the Corbin Hill Historic District, a designation Grandma had always been proud of, the kind of status that came with strict rules about what could and couldn't be altered on a protected property. Gerald, apparently feeling territorial about a kitchen he had no legal claim to, had ripped out Grandma's original counters and cabinets in the second week, trying to make the place feel like his. He didn't pull a permit. He didn't know he needed one. A neighbor across the street, a retired school teacher named Dolores Whitfield, who'd known Grandma for 30 years and had never once cared for Gerald, called the Historic Preservation Office to report construction noise and dumpster activity at a house whose owner, as far as the county records showed, was not the man doing the work. The inspector who showed up was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Bettina Cross, and within an hour of walking the property, she'd issued a stop work order and confirmed, through the county recorder, that the deed on file named Maren Voss as sole owner. She left a notice on the door, $500 a day, retroactive to the date the unpermitted work began, accumulating until the violation was corrected or the property came into compliance. I hadn't asked her to do any of that. I hadn't needed to. Gerald had done it to himself, the same way he'd done everything else to himself for 30 years, and the house that had sheltered him for exactly 1 week was already coming apart at every seam he'd never bothered to check. He also tried the police. 10 days after the funeral, an officer from the Bellhaven PD called me, polite and clearly a little tired, to say that a Gerald Voss had filed a report alleging I was harassing him by cutting off utilities to a residence he occupied. I gave the officer Elliot Marsh's number and the recorded deed. He called back 20 minutes later to say the report had been closed with no further action, since a property owner disconnecting utility accounts held in her own name wasn't a criminal matter, and that Mr. Voss had been advised the address in question location was, according to county records, not his legal residence. Gerald never mentioned the police report to me directly. I only found out because the officer, apparently as tired of Gerald's version of events as everyone else was starting to become, thought I deserved to know someone had tried. Somewhere around the second week, Gerald changed tactics. He stopped calling me directly and started calling everyone else instead. My Aunt Carol, his own ex-wife, got a call where he described me as a vulture who'd swooped in before Grandma's body was cold to seize a house he'd been promised his whole life. Two of Grandma's old church friends got calls too. Women in their 70s who'd known Gerald since he was a boy and who, out of a kind of reflexive loyalty to the child they remembered, started leaving me sympathetic voicemails about how hard this must all be for him, how maybe I could find it in my heart to work something out. I listened to those voicemails standing in my kitchen and felt something twist in my chest that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with recognizing, clearly for the first time, how good Gerald had always been at making himself the victim of consequences he'd created. He tried it once with Elliot Marsh directly, calling the office and telling the receptionist he needed to discuss correcting some confusion about his mother's true wishes, as though the will itself were the thing in error rather than his understanding of it. Elliot called me afterward, bemused, to let me know, and to reassure me that nothing about the estate's legal standing had changed. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat with the quiet, ugly realization that Gerald wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. He was trying to build a chorus of people who'd vouch for his version of events regardless of what the paperwork actually said, the same way he'd built one at every holiday table for 30 years, using sympathy the way other people use evidence. It didn't work the way he hoped. Dolores Whitfield, who fielded one of his calls herself, told me flatly that she'd watched him borrow her own late husband's table saw 11 years earlier and never return it, and that she wasn't in the business of feeling sorry for a grown man who broke into a dead woman's house. Carol, for her part, called me not to relay Gerald's version but to apologize for even picking up, and to tell me in a tired voice that she'd spent 15 years married to a man who could make his own failures sound like everyone else's cruelty, and that she recognized the pattern the moment he opened his mouth. It was the first time I understood that I wasn't the only person who'd spent years absorbing Gerald's version of reality, instead of trusting what I'd actually seen with my own eyes. 3 weeks after the funeral, Gerald called me sobbing. No performance in it this time, or at least less of one. The power was still off. The insurance was gone. A pipe in the crawl space, the same copper pipe Grandma's plumber had warned her about years before, had frozen overnight and burst sometime while Gerald was running space heaters to compensate for the lack of central heat, and by the time he noticed, $200,000 of water damage had spread through the basement and up into the first floor. The fines from the city were still climbing. $500 for every day the kitchen sat torn open and out of compliance. "You have to help me," he said. "This is out of control." I let the silence sit there for a second before I answered. "I offered to help you once already, Gerald. I still will. Sign a written confession admitting you broke into that house without permission and changed the locks on a property you knew wasn't legally yours. Pay me $50,000 for the utilities I've had to cover and the damage your negligence caused. Do that, and I'll take the house, the debt, and the mess off your hands entirely. You walk away clean." He laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. Nothing like the sobbing from 30 seconds earlier. "You're out of your mind if you think I'm giving you $1, he said. "I already won. I'm in the house. You're not. You're in a house with no power, no insurance, and a basement full of water," I said. "That's not winning, Gerald. That's just the first part of losing slower." He slammed the phone down so hard I heard it crack against something on his end. I sat at my kitchen table afterward and looked at the growing folder of documents in front of me. The reverse mortgage notice, the contractor estimates, the historic district fines, Harold Pruitt's cancellation letter, and I understood for the first time that I wasn't the one doing this to Gerald anymore. I was just the one keeping score. The following Monday, I hired Rosalind Krantz. Grandma's own lawyer, Elliot Marsh, had handled the estate paperwork perfectly well, but I needed someone who specialized in exactly this kind of fight, and a friend from work who'd gone through a brutal divorce recommended Rosalind by name, calling her the most terrifying woman in a blazer I have ever met in my life. She read through the entire file in our first meeting: the deed, the power of attorney, the reverse mortgage notice, Bettina Cross's stop work order, and she smiled the way a person smiles when they've just been handed a winning hand. "We're going to squeeze him from every direction," she said. "Legal, financial, municipal. He's not going to know which one hits him first." She filed an emergency motion for unlawful detainer that week, formally establishing that Gerald had no legal right to occupy the property. She coordinated directly with Meridian Trust's foreclosure department to make sure the 30-day notice was airtight and correctly served, and she made a single phone call to Bettina Cross, not to ask for anything improper, just to confirm, on the record, exactly who the legal owner of the property was and who the unpermitted occupant doing the construction had turned out to be. Bettina already knew. She'd known since the day she pulled the deed, but hearing it confirmed by an attorney seemed to settle something for her, because the fines, which had been accumulating quietly, suddenly showed up in a formal notice addressed directly to Gerald by name, care of the Larkspur Lane address, informing him that as the responsible party for the unpermitted work, he was personally liable for every dollar. 3 days after that, the foreclosure notice arrived. 30 days to pay Meridian Trust $300,000 in full, or the house would go to auction, and Gerald, along with anyone else occupying it, would be removed by the county sheriff. He called me at 7 the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, screaming that I was stealing his inheritance, that Grandma would be ashamed of me, that I was turning into someone she wouldn't recognize. She'd recognize exactly who I am, I told him. "She's the one who taught me to protect what's mine. You're the one she had to protect it from." He hung up again. I was starting to lose count of how many times. The insurance adjuster who came to assess the flood damage confirmed what Harold Pruitt had already told me. There was no active policy on the property. Every dollar of the $200,000 in water damage, the basement, basement, the subfloor, the drywall Grandma had painted a soft yellow the year I turned 16, was coming out of Gerald's pocket, if he had one deep enough, which he didn't. Ronnie Petrakis came back out to look at the foundation a second time, after the flooding, and revised his estimate upward. $100,000 now, maybe more, because standing water had done exactly what standing water does to a 100-year-old crack in aging concrete. The power stayed off through all of it. Gerald, unwilling or unable to come up with the $800 deposit, had been running 2 space heaters off a heavy-duty extension cord plugged into the one working outlet on the back porch, drawing more current than that circuit had ever been designed to carry. An electrician doing a routine safety sweep for the historic district, something Bettina had ordered as a condition of lifting the stop work order, found the setup and red-tagged the entire property as unsafe for occupancy until the panel was replaced. $30,000 in mandatory rewiring, and now, officially, nowhere legal for Gerald to sleep. It was Bettina, on that same visit, who found the kitchen tiles. Grandma's original 1920s hexagonal floor tile, the kind you don't find in stores anymore, the kind a historic preservation office specifically protects, smashed into pieces and bagged up in black contractor bags stacked against the side of the garage. Gerald had ripped them out along with the counters and never even bothered to dispose of them properly. Bettina issued a second stop work order on the spot, and with it, another $500 a day, layered on top of the first. The final pipe burst 2 weeks after the first one, this time in a section of the crawl space nobody had gotten around to draining after the panel was red-tagged and the heat went fully off. 3 feet of standing water filled the basement by the time anyone noticed. I drove over that afternoon, not to gloat, though I understood if it looked that way, but because Dolores Whitfield had called me, worried, saying she'd seen water seeping out from under the garage door and pooling on the driveway. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the house I'd grown up in and watched water stains creep up the foundation like a tide line, and somewhere under all of it were Grandma's photo albums, the physical, irreplaceable pictures of my parents that I hadn't thought to move out before Gerald locked me out of the house. I felt the loss of those photographs like a hand closing around my throat. I did not, even in that moment, feel 1 ounce of guilt about anything else. Gerald came outside while I was standing there, barefoot, on the wet driveway, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He looked at the water pooling around his ankles, then at me, like he expected me to offer some kind of reprieve simply because I was standing close enough to see how bad it had gotten. I didn't. I thought about the years of Sunday dinners he'd skipped, the birthdays he'd missed, the version of this family he could have been part of if he'd ever once shown up without needing something first, and I let the silence between us say what I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. He went back inside without a word. I got in my car and drove home, and for the first time since the funeral, I slept the whole night through. 24 days after the funeral, Gerald showed up at my apartment at 6 in the morning. I heard the knock before I was fully awake, and when I opened the door he was standing there unshaven, in the same clothes he'd apparently been wearing for days, shaking, though I couldn't tell if it was from cold or exhaustion or something closer to fear. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "Take the house back. Please, I'm begging you." I crossed my arms and stood in the doorway. "My offer still stands," I said. "Written confession. $50,000. "I don't have $50,000, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I don't have anything. I'm sleeping in my car, Marin. The house is condemned. The number goes up $5,000 every week you wait," I said, which was true, because Rosalind and I had built that clause into the offer specifically to remove any incentive for him to stall. He looked at me like he genuinely could not understand how any of this had happened, like the last 24 days had been an act of God rather than the accumulated weight of every choice he'd made, going back decades, finally landing on him at once. He turned to leave. That's when my phone buzzed in my hand, still standing in the doorway in my pajamas at 6 in the morning. A text message from Rosalind Krantz. "Check your email, now." I opened it right there, Gerald still on the porch steps, still watching me with the wrecked, hollow expression of a man who no longer had anywhere else to go. My hands went cold reading the subject line. Urgent, fraud unit findings, Voss Estate. I read the email twice before I fully understood what I was looking at, and by the second time, my ears were ringing. Rosalind had spent the past 3 weeks pulling every document related to the estate, standard practice for a case this contentious, and one line item had snagged her attention almost immediately. A quitclaim deed, filed with the Belhaven County Recorder's Office on May 28th, 5 days before Grandma died. The filer listed was Gerald Voss. The notary who'd stamped it was Walt Higgins. I remembered the folder. I remembered stepping out for coffee. I remembered thinking at the time that Gerald was finally being useful. The deed had been rejected on a technicality, a mismatched legal description in the property boundaries that the Recorder's Office flagged automatically, which meant it had never actually transferred anything. But rejection didn't erase the attempt, and a rejected filing still sits in the county system, time-stamped, searchable, waiting for exactly the kind of attorney who knows to go looking for it. Rosalind had gone looking. What she found wasn't just a failed real estate transaction, it was Gerald, sitting at his dying mother's bedside 11 days before she passed, presenting a woman heavily sedated on hospice-grade morphine, with a stack of papers she likely couldn't have read clearly, let alone understood, and having her sign a deed transferring the Larkspur Lane property directly into his name. Walt Higgins had notarized it anyway, either without verifying her competency or without caring to. The county recorder's rejection had, without anyone intending it, saved the paper trail. And because the filing had triggered an automatic fraud flag once a formal ownership dispute was opened on the same property, Adult Protective Services had already begun a parallel review. Rosalind's email laid it out in language so clinical it took my breath away. Attempted deed fraud. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder. A signature obtained under medical incapacity. Notarized by a party with a prior personal relationship to the beneficiary. The case had been referred that morning to the Belhaven County Prosecutor's Office. Rosalind had attached the hospice chart notes too. too, subpoenaed as part of the fraud review, and I made myself read them standing in my own doorway. Gerald still 10 feet away on the steps. Medication administration record, June 21st through June 24th, the exact window the quitclaim had been signed inside of. Morphine sulfate, 4 milligrams every 4 hours, alongside a note from the attending nurse, a woman named Priscilla Adeyemi, documenting that the patient had been intermittently oriented, drowsy, difficulty tracking conversation on the afternoon in question. That was the afternoon I'd stepped out for coffee. That was the exact window Walt Higgins had stamped his notary seal on a deed transferring my grandmother's house out from under her, while a nurse's note in the same chart was documenting, almost in real time, that she couldn't reliably follow a conversation. I stood there with my phone in my hand and felt something in my understanding of the last month reorganize itself completely. Every phone call, every locked door, every desperate plea Gerald had made to me over the preceding 3 weeks had been, underneath it, a man trying to outrun a piece of paper he already knew was a felony. I looked up from my phone. Gerald was still standing on my porch steps, one hand braced against the railing, waiting for me to say something, still under the impression that the worst thing he'd done was change a lock. "You tried to steal the house before she even died," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You had a notary sit in her hospice room and get her to sign a deed while she was too sedated to know what she was looking at." Gerald's face went through 3 or 4 expressions in the space of 2 seconds. I watched him try denial first. "That's not, she wanted to help me, Marin," she said. "She told her lawyer in writing 2 years ago that this house was mine and that you weren't to have authority over anything," I said. "You knew that. That's exactly why you needed a notary who wasn't Elliot Marsh. That's exactly why you did it while I was out of the room. You don't understand what it's like," he started, and his voice cracked into something pleading, something that might have worked on me once, years earlier, before I'd watched him do this same thing in a dozen smaller ways across 3 decades. "I'm 56 years old. I have nothing. She was going to leave me nothing. She left you exactly what she decided you'd earned," I said. "You've spent your whole life deciding that wasn't enough." That was when Priya's car pulled up to the curb. I hadn't called her. I found out later that Rosalind had, as a courtesy, since Priya was Gerald's own daughter, and under the fraud referral, technically an interested party who deserved to know what her father was being investigated for. Priya was 31, a nurse who lived 2 towns over, and she and Gerald hadn't spoken in almost 4 years, not since he'd borrowed $11,000 from her for a business that never existed and never paid a cent of it back. She got out of the car slowly, looking between her father and me on the porch, and I watched something in her face harden as she pieced together, in real time, exactly what she was walking into. "Dad," she said, "what did you do?" Gerald turned to her, and for a moment, I watched him try on the same performance he'd given at the funeral, the same wounded, misunderstood expression, the tears already gathering. "Priya, baby, it's not what it looks like. Your grandmother wanted—" "Don't," Priya said, just that one word, flat and final, and it landed harder than anything I'd said to him in 24 days. "I heard what your niece just said. You had grandma sign something while she was on morphine. You did that to her, and now you're standing on someone else's porch asking for sympathy." She looked at me, not at him. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have believed it was worse than he told me." Gerald's face crumpled. Real tears this time, I think, though by then, I'd stopped being able to tell the difference, and honestly, it no longer mattered. "I just wanted something for myself," he said, "to both of us, to neither of us. For once, I wanted one thing that was mine." "It was never going to be yours," I said. "Not because I decided that, because she did. Years before any of this happened. You spent 30 years proving her right instead of trying to prove her wrong." A neighbor 2 doors down had come out onto his own porch by then, drawn by the raised voices, and Mrs. Alvarez from the apartment above mine had cracked her window, not bothering to hide that she was listening. I noticed them and didn't lower my voice. I'd spent a month being quiet about what Gerald had done, careful, procedural, letting lawyers and inspectors and prosecutors say the ugly words on my behalf because I hadn't trusted myself yet to say them without falling apart. Standing there with his daughter beside him and strangers watching from their windows, I finally understood I didn't need to be quiet about it anymore. I told him then, standing on that porch with his own daughter beside me, the thing I'd been carrying since the night he first opened that door in Grandma's bathrobe. "I loved you, Gerald. Not the way I loved her, but you were the only piece of my dad I had left, and some part of me kept hoping you'd remember that. You didn't just take a house from me. You took the last chance I had to feel like I still had an uncle." My voice held. I made sure of it. "That's done now. Whatever happens with the prosecutor, whatever happens with the house, I'm not doing this with you anymore. I'm done." He didn't say anything else. He sat down on my porch steps, right where he was standing, and put his face in his hands, and Priya stood over him for a long moment before she finally sat down beside him. Not out of forgiveness, I think, but because he was still her father, and some part of her hadn't finished grieving the man he could have been either. I went back inside and called Rosalind. The Belhaven County Prosecutor's Office moved faster than I expected. Within a week, Gerald was formally charged with attempted deed fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony under Ohio's elder abuse statute, given Grandma's documented medical incapacity at the time of the signing. Walt Higgins lost his notary commission within the month and was named as a co-defendant, facing his own charges for knowingly notarizing a document without properly verifying the signer's competency. He tried to claim he hadn't known about her diagnosis. Nobody who'd seen the hospice bracelet on her wrist believed him. I sat in the gallery for the preliminary hearing, 3 rows back, the same distance I'd kept from Gerald at the funeral, though nothing else about the room felt the same. He looked smaller in a courtroom than he had on my porch, smaller than he had for 30 years at Grandma's dinner table. Dressed in a blazer that didn't fit him quite right, his public defender leaning over to murmur something before he stood to enter his initial plea. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Okonkwo who'd clearly seen 100 cases exactly like this one, read the charges aloud in a flat, unhurried voice, and I watched Gerald's shoulders drop lower lower with every sentence. Attempted deed fraud. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult in the first degree. She set bail low, given his age and the fact that he was, at that point, functionally homeless. But she added a condition that made the whole room go quiet. No contact, direct or indirect, with the victim's estate representative, meaning me, pending trial. Gerald's head turned toward the gallery when she said it. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see that I wasn't going to flinch. Not anymore. Not after everything it had taken to get to that room. The prosecutor, a soft-voiced but relentless woman named Adeze Nwosu, built her case less around outrage and more around timeline, which I came to understand was far more damning. She laid out in careful order the dates. The power of attorney filed 2 years before Grandma's death, naming me and explicitly excluding Gerald. The hospice admission. The notary visit, 11 days before death, while Grandma was documented as receiving scheduled doses of morphine sulfate every 4 hours. The quitclaim deed, filed 3 days later, rejected by the county recorder on a technicality that had nothing to do with its underlying fraud. Adeze put it to the courtroom plainly. This wasn't a son making a mistake in grief. This was a man executing a plan while his mother was still breathing, and only failing because a clerical error caught what his own conscience hadn't. The family split exactly the way I expected it would, and in a few ways I didn't. My Aunt Carol, Gerald's ex-wife, hadn't spoken to him in 6 years, and made it clear she wasn't about to start defending him now, though she did call me once, awkwardly, to say she was sorry for whatever role her own silence over the decades might have played in letting him become this. 2 of Gerald's old drinking buddies actually showed up to a preliminary hearing to support him, sitting behind him in matching flannel like a chosen family assembled specifically for this occasion, and I remember feeling almost nothing when I saw them, just a distant kind of tiredness. Priya, to my genuine surprise, became something like an ally. She testified when the prosecutor asked about the $11,000, about the pattern, about a lifetime of watching her father treat every relationship as a resource to be extracted, rather than a person to be loved. It cost her something to say it. I could see that, but she said it anyway. Dolores Whitfield, of all people, ended up being one of the most important witnesses in the case, not because she knew anything about the deed, but because she'd lived across the street from that house for 30 years and could speak in plain and devastating detail to exactly how attentive Grandma had always been about her affairs, right up until the illness took that away from her. Her testimony, more than anything else, was what convinced the judge that the sedated signature couldn't have reflected Grandma's actual wishes. It contradicted everything Eleanor Voss had said and done for the entirety of her adult life. Gerald made a few desperate final moves before the plea deal came through. He tried briefly to sell off some of Grandma's furniture that was still sitting in a storage unit he'd rented under a fake urgency, claiming it was his to liquidate, until Rosalind sent a cease and desist so sharp the storage facility froze the unit within hours. I drove out there once the freeze was in place, mostly out of curiosity, and found the unit half emptied already, a buyer's van still idling in the lot, a stranger holding one end of Grandma's cedar hope chest, the one she'd kept quilts in since before I was born, confused about why the sale had suddenly fallen through. I bought the man a coffee for his trouble and drove the chest home myself in the back of my hatchback, the lid rattling the whole way, and cried in my driveway for the second time that year, this time from something closer to relief than grief. He tried once, calling me from a number I didn't recognize, to ask if I'd consider dropping the civil complaint if he agreed to a plea on the criminal side. I let Rosalind handle that call. She told him, in words I wished I'd thought of myself, that the civil complaint existed to recover what he'd cost the estate, and that his remorse, real or performed, didn't change a single dollar of the damage. He tried a version of the same argument through his public defender a week later, framing it as an unstable state of mind at the time of the notary visit, an argument that fell apart the moment Adeze Nwosu pointed out he'd hired Walt Higgins specifically, driven him to the hospice himself, and waited outside the door until I left the room. Instability doesn't drive a man to plan a route around his own niece's coffee break. It requires a working memory of her habits, and a plan built around them. In the end, he took a plea. 18 months, suspended to probation given his age and lack of prior record, restitution ordered at $280,000 to cover the flood damage, the foundation, the electrical, and the historic district fines, payable over a repayment schedule that would likely follow him for the rest of his working life. Walt Higgins lost his license permanently and paid a smaller restitution amount tied directly to the notarization itself. Neither of them went to prison. I'd expected to feel angrier about that than I did. Mostly I just felt tired, the specific bone-deep tired that comes after a fight you've been carrying so long you forgot what it felt like to put it down. There was a night, a few weeks after the plea deal, when I drove out to Larkspur Lane alone, before the restoration work had even started, and sat in my car in the driveway looking at the house with its boarded front window and its stop work notices still taped, faded, to the door. I let myself cry there, finally, for the first time since the funeral. Not for Gerald exactly, though some small, stubborn part of me still grieved the uncle I'd wanted him to be, the one who might have shown up to Thanksgiving because he wanted to, not because he needed something. Mostly I cried for Grandma, for the 11 days she'd spent in that hospice bed, not knowing her own son had used her weakest moment to try to take from her the one gift she'd been so deliberate about giving me. I cried for the version of our family that could have existed if any of it had gone differently, decades earlier, before the pattern calcified into something none of us could undo. Grief and relief sat in the same seat that night. I've stopped expecting them not to. The insurance claim against Gerald personally, combined with the restitution order, ended up covering most of the repair costs, though it took the better part of a year to untangle through the courts. Meridian Trust agreed to a modified payoff plan on the reverse mortgage once the estate's ownership was fully settled, which let me refinance the balance instead of losing the house to auction outright. It wasn't simple. Refinance balancing a reverse mortgage balance on a property still tangled up in a criminal restitution order meant 3 separate underwriters, 2 appraisals, and a title company that insisted on running the deed history back to 1962 just to be sure nothing else was buried in it. Rosalind handled most of it. Billing hours I tried not to look at too closely, though she cut her rate more than once, telling me flatly that she didn't often get a case this clean to win. Ronnie Petrakis fixed the foundation over the course of a long, dusty August. Felix replaced the entire electrical panel, brought it fully up to code, and even found, tucked behind the old Federal Pacific box, a rusted cigar tin Grandma had apparently hidden there decades earlier, containing $70 in old bills and a note in her handwriting that said simply, "For emergencies." I have that note framed now on the wall above the new panel, where nobody but me will ever understand why. Priya came by the house twice during the restoration, once to help me sort through what was left of the kitchen debris Gerald had bagged and never hauled away, and once unannounced on a Sunday afternoon almost exactly a year after the funeral, holding a container of tomato sandwiches she'd made from a recipe she said she'd gotten secondhand, years ago, from a version of Grandma she barely remembered. We sat on the back porch steps, the ones that hadn't rotted through yet, and she told me about growing up mostly without Gerald in any real sense, even when he was technically present, about learning early to expect nothing, so she'd never be disappointed, a strategy I recognized in myself more than I wanted to admit. She asked if I thought there was any version of her father that could have been saved, any earlier fork in the road. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know, and that I'd stopped needing an answer to keep living my own life. She nodded like that was the answer she'd actually come for. We've kept the Sunday visits going, on and off, since then. Not every week, but often enough that it started to feel like something worth calling a beginning. The financial fallout for Gerald didn't end with the criminal restitution. Meridian Trust, once it became clear the attempted quitclaim deed had been an act of fraud rather than a simple filing error, referred the matter to their own internal fraud division, which pursued a separate civil claim against him for the legal costs of untangling the false filing from the title. His credit, already ruined by decades of defaulted loans, was effectively destroyed. He filed for personal bankruptcy 8 months after the plea, a filing that excluded the restitution order entirely, since criminal restitution can't be discharged that way, meaning the debt to the estate would follow him regardless of what else he shed. I didn't celebrate when I heard about the bankruptcy. I just felt the last piece of the structure I'd built finally settle into place, load-bearing and permanent, exactly the way Grandma's power of attorney had been 2 years before any of this started. I live in that house now. I moved in 7 months after the funeral, once the last of the repairs were finished and the historic district had signed off on every corrected violation, including a full, faithful restoration of the original hexagonal kitchen tile, sourced from a reclamation dealer 2 states away at a cost that made Rosalind wince when she saw the invoice. The garden is coming back too, slowly. Dolores helps me with it some Saturdays, showing me which hostas to divide, the way Grandma used to. I found a handful of the photo albums salvageable after all, dried out and warped but legible, and I keep them in a fireproof box now, upstairs, in the room that used to be my father's. I kept the cigar tin note, and I kept one other thing too, something small I almost threw out during the cleanup, the laminated index card of emergency numbers from the visor of the old Buick, water-stained but readable, half of it in my own 16-year-old handwriting. I put it in a drawer in the kitchen, the same drawer where Gerald's faded apology card had sat for years before I found it. I think about that sometimes, the two of them existing in the same small space, evidence of 2 very different ways of being handed responsibility. Grandma made me write down the numbers myself because she believed the act of writing them would make them mine. Gerald spent his whole life waiting for someone else to write things down for him and blaming everyone else when the bill came due anyway. I don't talk to Gerald. I don't imagine I will again. Priya and I still text sometimes, mostly about nothing. Sometimes about him, always carefully, the way you talk about a wound that hasn't fully closed on either side. I heard, through her, that he's living in a rented room above a hardware store on the east side of town, working part-time, paying down a debt that will outlast most of his remaining years. I don't feel triumphant when I hear that. I used to think I would. What I feel instead is something closer to what Grandma must have felt, watching him drive off into the cold that Thanksgiving night 3 years before she died, still hoping despite every piece of evidence that he might someday become a different kind of man. I don't have that hope left in me. I think that's the real thing I lost in all of this. More than the photographs. More than the 6 weeks it took to fully drain and repair the basement. I lost the last excuse I had for keeping a door open to him. People ask me sometimes, when they hear the shorter version of this story, whether I regret how far I let it go. The utilities, the insurance, the contractor estimates I never intended to act on, the slow, deliberate dismantling of every illusion Gerald had about how easy it would be to simply take what wasn't his. I don't regret it. Some people, when they hear how methodical it all was, ask if I planned it from the very first night on that porch. I didn't. Not really. I only did what any careful person does when someone tries to take something from them by force. I looked at what I actually had, and I used every bit of it. I built exactly what he needed built. A structure that showed him, piece by piece, precisely who he'd always been, with nowhere left to hide from it, and no one left standing behind him who hadn't already seen it too. He didn't come to my doorstep that morning because I'd trapped him. He came because, for the first time in his life, there was no one else left to perform for. I think about the house sometimes late at night, the way it stood empty and cold for those weeks, water rising in the basement while he ran space heaters off a porch outlet and told himself he'd won. I think about my grandmother's hand, trembling but determined, signing her name at Elliot Marsh's office 2 years before any of this happened, making sure that whatever else might fall apart, this one thing would hold. It held. That's the part I try to remember on the hard nights, when the grief for the family I didn't get outweighs the relief of the fight I won. She built something that lasted. In the end, so did did I. The house on Larkspur Lane is standing, restored, mine, exactly the way she always said it would be. What I built wasn't a trap for Gerald. It was a mirror. He just couldn't survive what it showed him. Some nights I still can't quite believe he begged me, right there on my own front steps, to save him from something I built entirely out of the truth he'd spent 30 years running from. I didn't save him. I don't think I could have, even if I'd wanted to. Some people aren't looking to be saved. They're looking for someone else to blame for the moment the truth finally catches up to them. I stopped being willing to be that person for him the night he opened my grandmother's door in her bathrobe and told me possession was 9/10 of the law. He was right about the law. He was wrong about everything else. And in the end, that was the only ownership that ever really mattered.